Phone login. Hello, today I will guide you through Firebase phone login. First of all, using an actual phone number for login is paid, not free, so please refer to this link for more details. During today's session, we won't use an actual phone number, but instead, we'll create a test phone number for demonstration purposes. Here's the outline for today. Of course, we need to enable phone login in the Firebase project, so we'll start with that. Then, I will show you how to set up the test number. Afterward, we need to configure the settings for both Android and Apple, and I will walk you through those steps. Next, for phone login, we need to include a library that shows global country codes, as phone login is now used worldwide, not just in Korea. I'll also introduce a few tips, and finally, we'll test it out and wrap up the video. Opening Flutter Phone Authentication Documentation. First, open the Flutter Phone Authentication Documentation. On the left, click on Flutter phone number, and you'll see the settings section. We will follow the document exactly. Since it asks us to configure phone login in the Firebase console first, let's do that. This is the project we created last time. If you don't have one, please create a new project and follow along. Afterward, click on Build, then click on Authentication, and click Get Started. Here, click on Phone to enable it. Then, click the pencil icon again, and you'll see the option to select a test phone number. I've chosen +821012341234, and the verification code I set is 123 to 456. Also, to prevent any potential errors, I will enable Google Login as well. Now that we're done with that, we need to let our project know that we've added phone in Google Login. As you can see, there's a prompt telling us to replace the Google Services.json file, so I'll use Flutter Firebase CLI to update it. Note, if you don't have this file, just replace it manually. Click on Flutter Firebase Configure and choose No for the first option and Yes for the second option. The file will automatically download. Enter your project's package name, and the file will be automatically downloaded. Now, let's return to the documentation. Back to the documentation. Now that we're back, the second step is to configure SHA-1 and SHA-256. Go ahead and click the gear icon for project settings. Scroll down to the Android section, and you'll see the option for SHA. Click it, and a Google document will open. You'll find a command that you can copy and run. Since I'm on a Mac, I copied this command, and when I paste it into Terminal, it asks for a password. The password is Android, which is mentioned in the documentation. Just enter it, and the digital fingerprint will be generated. Copy this fingerprint and click the Add Fingerprint button to add it. Now, let's go back to the Flutter Phone Authentication documentation. Apple configuration. Next, we need to set up Apple Phone Authentication. Open the Apple Phone Authentication documentation, and we can skip past the steps we've already completed. In the section about App Authentication, there are two ways to configure it. The first method is using an actual phone with push notifications for verification. The second method is using a simulator. Since push notifications don't work on the simulator, it will use a CAPTCHA verification screen. So when it comes to phone number authentication, there are two methods. For real phones, you'll use push notifications, and for simulators, you'll use CAPTCHA. If you're developing an app, you should set up both. Let's look at the first method for real phones. The documentation says to set up notifications in Xcode. In your Flutter project, right-click the iOS folder and click Open in Xcode. When Xcode opens, click the plus button at the top right and type push, and you'll see the notification option. Just select it to add the notification. However, as you can see, my Xcode has two errors. The first is a license agreement error, which can be fixed by going to the App Store Connect, clicking the yellow banner at the top, and agreeing to the terms. The second error is about the provisioning profile. This can be fixed by logging into App Store Connect, clicking on the app, and adding a certificate under Certificates, Identifiers, and Profiles. You'll need to copy the bundle identifier from Xcode and add the push notification capability as well. After selecting it, click Continue and Register to remove the error. Back to the documentation. Going back to the documentation, the next step is to upload the Firebase authentication key for your Apple app. In other words, You need to register your Apple app in the Firebase project so that it can receive phone authentication notifications. To do this, you first need to generate the authentication key for your Apple app. You can do this by clicking the key icon on the left side, then clicking the plus button. Give it a name and description, then make sure to select the APN notification option, then click Continue. After that, click Download to save the key. Now, let's go back to the Firebase console, go to the Cloud Messaging tab and scroll down. You'll see a message saying, No APN Authentication Key. Click the Upload button and upload the P8 file you just downloaded. You'll need to enter your Apple Team ID and other relevant information, which you can find by going back to the Apple developer page. The Team ID is located in the upper right corner of the page along with your name. Copy and paste this information into Firebase. Once that's done, go back to the documentation. We can now move on to the next step. Final Apple configuration. Now that we've completed the Apple setup, we need to configure background modes and push notifications in Xcode. In Xcode, open your project, go to the runner target, and click the plus button in the background mode section. Double-click it to add background modes and select Push Notifications. Once that's done, we can proceed to the simulator setup. Next, let's configure the simulator to use CAPTCHA for phone number verification. Open Firebase console, click the gear icon, and scroll to the Apple app section. Copy the encoded app ID here and go to Xcode. In the runner settings, open Info and scroll down. Under URL types, paste the app ID you copied earlier into the URL scheme. That's it for the Apple setup. Code setup and final testing. Now let's move on to the code. We won't be covering the web part, so let's scroll down to the section where the usage is explained. We'll be using the native platform, so we'll copy the code from there. First, we need to install the necessary libraries. Search for Flutter Firebase Auth on Google, and you'll find the package we need to enable phone authentication. After installing it, we can start writing the login code. I'll delete all the code starting from line 44 in my project. In the libs/screens folder, I'll create a new file called login_screen.dart. I'll create a stateful widget and call it login screen. Then, I'll copy the native login code from the Flutter documentation and paste it into the new file. I'll fix any errors by importing the necessary libraries and updating return types. On line 19, we already have a phone number input, but since we want the user to input the phone number, I'll change the parameter to a string called form number. Then, I'll replace the phone number part with that variable. Under lines 20 to 23, I'll handle the phone authentication callbacks: successful authentication, failure, code sent, and timeout. First, I'll print something when the authentication fails. Then, I'll go back to the document and check in more detail. There's a detailed explanation about the callbacks here. If we scroll down, there are example codes for each callback that I can follow. Let's scroll down. The first one is for when authentication is complete, but this is only supported on Android devices. I'll just copy and paste it. The auth error occurs because we're using Firebase auth as it is, so I'll create the auth variable and update it as the document suggests. Then below that, there's the section for when authentication fails. I'll copy and paste it the same way. Further down, we get to the section for when the SMS code is sent. This handler is triggered when the verification code is sent. There are two parameters here: verification ID and resend token. However, the resend token is only supported on Android devices. Scrolling down again, there's the part where, if the verification code is not confirmed within a certain amount of time, this code is executed. The default is 60 seconds. For example, if the verification code isn't confirmed within 1 minute, we could show a pop-up. I'll add that code as well. Now, the code is almost ready. But for phone authentication, we need a phone number input field, right? As you know, every country has its own country code. To simplify things, I'll use a library called phone number input. I'll open the page and copy-paste the installation instructions here. After installing it, I'll use the example code as it is. Scroll down, and I'll copy everything from the My Homepage state part to the end and paste it into our code. I'll remove the duplicate build part for now. In lines 18 and 19, I'll change the default country code to Korea. Now the country code is roughly set. Before running it, I'll add a few missing settings and test it. First, I need to wrap the form in a scaffold on line 23, or else it will throw an error. When I run the code, 3 buttons will appear on the screen: Validate, Update, and Save. Since I need to see how the phone number is handled when I enter it, I'll print it on line 32. On line 55, I'll remove the Validate button functionality and update the button name to Korean. I'll also insert the phone login function I made earlier inside the button, so it will be executed when the Verify button is clicked. The phone number needs to be passed as a parameter, so I'll remove the unnecessary update code. Subtitles 61 to 67. Scrolling up, I'll confirm that the phone number is being received as we saw in the print statement on line 32. I'll store the phone number in a variable called number on line 19 and pass it along. So, below the print statement, I'll assign the user's entered number to the variable. Then, I'll pass the number from this variable to the phone login function. When I run the test, I'll see that the phone number is being passed correctly. Now, there's just one thing left. We need a verification code input field. This input field should only be shown when the user clicks the Verify button, so I'll need a variable to manage that condition. At the top of the code, I'll create a variable called showCode field and set it to false by default. In line 62, where the Verify button is, I'll check if showCode field is true. If it is, I'll show the verification code input field, and if it's false, I'll show an empty container. Using the quick fix, I'll create the widget and set up a text input field like this. I'll also create a variable for the SMS code, which will be an empty string by default. When the user enters the code, I'll store the value in this variable. Now, I'll go back to the phone login function. Since this part is triggered when the verification code is sent, I'll remove line 97. When the verification code is sent, I'll update showCode field to true, so the verification code input field appears. I'll also create a new variable called login button clicked, which will be set to true when the login button is clicked. For now, I'll ignore any errors, and I'll scroll up to copy and paste the Verify button section and change its name to Login. When the button is clicked, I'll set login button click to true. This will trigger the login process. Scrolling up again, I'll add the necessary variable for login button clicked. Next, I'll go back to the phone login code and move the login logic from here to the login button on click part, so the login happens immediately when the login button is clicked. There are a few missing variables, so I'll create a Firebase auth instance. The verification ID is generated automatically, so I'll create a variable to store it. Now I'll run it again. When I click the login button, the screen remains the same, but in the Firebase console, I can see that the user is already authenticated. Now, just to make things a bit more interesting, let's create a home page and handle navigation. Finally, I'll wrap this up by showing a test video. For anyone encountering Apple-related errors, I've added troubleshooting tips at the end of the video, so please check them out.